Hello. So today we're going to start our first chapter book. It's a small chapter book, but it is a true story about a dog named Max. I am going to dedicate this true story to Matthew because he is so good at telling the truth. So I'll read you the foreword to begin with. Every now and then, one runs across a tale of great animal courage and wisdom. The animal lover within us smiles and nods, but we are not too surprised, for we love them because they are brave and wise. However, the true story of Max transcends any in my experience. His indomitable will to live, his refusal, again and again, to accept defeat, and through it all, his unfaltering faith in humans must reach all of us in many different ways. Max came back and paid his dues by opening some doors for some troubled people. However, it doesn't stop there. He will linger with many of us for all time, to bark a soft echo of encouragement when times are rough. I am proud to know him. Betty White. Yes, the Betty White, stage, screen, and television star. She wrote the foreword. There aren't very many pictures, but I'll show you this first picture. And here we go. In the car, George commanded. Our two Dobermans obediently jumped into the back of the station wagon, behind a special grate separating the passenger section from the dog's own compartment. Max, the elder of the two, his beautiful black coat shining like satin, settled down on the foam rubber mattress at once. He knew from experience that a long road trip was ahead of him. He watched us placing suitcases in the car and knew that it meant a vacation. All during the loading of the car, he was nervous, afraid that he might be left behind. But now he could relax and take it easy. He was certain that he was going too. Hildy, the 7-month-old chocolate brown female, was too excited to settle down. She playfully bit Max's ear, but he did not even growl. He just shook his head, rattling his tags, and stuck his nose between his great paws. He knew that she would settle down soon. He saw that I had thoughtfully provided Hildy with a hard ball to chew on. Soon she would start on the ball, and then, bored and pacified by the rhythmic sound of the wheels and the smooth movement of the car, she too would fall asleep. George and I were looking forward to this little trip. He had never been to Sequoia National Park in the high Sierras, and it was years since I had been there. Besides, we had two guests visiting us, two brothers from Mexico City, Carlos and Francisco, aged 12 and 8, respectively. They were the sons of one of our best friends, an attorney. It seemed to us that the boys would enjoy a trip to the high Sierras. They had been to Disneyland and the movie studios, and we thought a trip to the mountains would be really exciting for the two city boys. We started early in the morning, having arranged to spend the night in a motel in 3 Rivers, a small community in the foothills. Planning to drive to the mountains early the following morning, the best time to enter the national forest. It was a pleasant drive, leaving crowded Los Angeles. The freeway, normally crowded, was really a free way at this hour, for thousands of cars were moving toward the city, bringing thousands of people to work, while very few cars were on the way out. In 8 hours, the flow would be reversed, but by that time, we would be 250 miles away in the quiet hamlet of 3 Rivers. Do you suppose there will actually be 3 rivers? Carlos asked. I'd like to see 3 rivers, all at the same time. Me too, cried the 8-year-old Francisco. He always agreed with what his older brother said. Well, we'll be lucky if we find even one, I replied. The way we have less and less rain each winter, I won't be surprised if soon there aren't any rivers left in Southern California. It will be nice if there is a real river, George remarked dreamily. We'll go for a walk along the banks. Immediately, the familiar phrase, go for a walk, had wonderful effect on the dogs. They lifted their heads, their intelligent eyes sparkling, their sharp white teeth gleaming as eager smiles appeared on their long faces. Max barked one short affirmative bark, which he always did when asked, "Do you want to go for a walk?" We laughed. "Boy, do they know those words," George exclaimed. Imagine, they were fast asleep, and yet they heard us. "Not yet," George told the dogs as he watched them in his rearview mirror. "Soon. Now go to sleep." Obediently, Max dropped his head on his paws again, sighed deeply, and closed his eyes. Hildy stood up, turned around several times as if performing a ritual dog dance, then stretched out next to Maxie and went to sleep. We drove along, passing small agricultural communities along the way. We stopped several times for a cup of coffee and then for lunch, letting the dogs out for a short walk on their leashes. We were not in a hurry. It was a lovely blue and golden day, a perfect California day, becoming more perfect with every minute that we drove farther away from the smoggy city. My husband, a doctor of psychiatry, began to sing. George was free for a few days, free of the hospital, free of patients, free to enjoy the mountains and the magnificent sequoia trees. "Teach us some Mexican songs," he said to the boys. "Do you know Cielito Lindo?" asked Carlos. "How does it go?" "Ay, ay, ay, ay," sang Francisco in a clear, high soprano. "Oh, yes, I know that one," exclaimed my husband as he joined the boys in a lusty rendition of the popular song. "I know it in Russian," I said. "Sing it," the boys begged, so I joined them in singing the Russian version of the lilting song. "Let's sing it in 3 different languages at the same time," Francisco cried with enthusiasm. So we did, laughing at the total confusion. The dogs lifted their heads at the sound of our singing, but hearing no familiar words, sighed contentedly and resumed their napping. George turned off the air conditioning and we opened the windows. The wind rushed into the car, rustling among the plastic bags containing our clothes and rocking them on their wire hangers. We drove along miles of orange groves and apple orchards in bloom, the aroma of the blossoms wafting into the car. We were off the main road by now and were driving towards Porterville and Lindsay, 2 small towns in the foothills of the high Sierras. "And to think that all of this once was nothing but a desert," said George. "Did you notice how they planted these groves? They all have irrigation ditches between the rows of trees. Their water bill must be enormous." We found our motel in 3 Rivers very pleasant. Our 2 rooms were at the back of the building, facing the fast-moving river beyond a stretch of sandy shores strewn with huge boulders and smooth river stones. During the rainy season, the shore must have been inundated by rushing waters, but now, late in May, the river had receded and become a rather shallow, though swift, stream. The boys and dogs joyfully leaped out of the car, jumping from stone to stone. They reached the stream in no time. The dogs thirstily began to lap up the icy water rushing down from the peaks of the Sierras. Hildy waded into the water, barking foolishly and exuberantly at the little rivulets gathering and then quickly dissipating around her legs. She tried to catch the rivulets in her mouth, but could not understand why all she could taste was water. Max, the wise old boy of almost 3 years of age, just stood on the flat rock watching his mate. He did not like to get his feet wet and cold. He knew better than to try to catch a wave. All one would get was a nose full of water. He had tried it once or twice when he was Hildy's age. He was with us on one of our trips to the mountains a couple of years ago. It was very early in spring, and the ground around Lake Arrowhead was still covered with snow. Max lapped happily ahead of us, joyfully biting mouthfuls of snow here and there. Suddenly, he saw a flock of ducks swimming near the landing. Without hesitation, he leaped off the pier into the icy lake. The ducks, quacking in loud excitement, scattered in all directions, leaving Maxie thrashing wildly in the water. He made his way back to the pier, feeling very foolish. We helped him climb up. He shook himself vigorously, sending a cascade of fine spray in all directions. The ducks regrouped and, feeling no threat, swam close to the pier, quacking as if taunting the unfortunate Max. He ignored them haughtily. Instead, he put on an exhibition of misery for our benefit. He trembled and lifted one paw, then another, demonstrating how cold it was to stand with wet feet on the frozen ground. We took pity on our would-be hunter. "Okay," George said, "let's go back to the car." Hearing his beloved word car, Maxie forgot his discomforts and dashed ahead of us to the parking lot. He knew exactly where the car was, and he waited there barking to hurry us on. I used paper napkins to dry Max as best I could, but he continued to shiver. With a sigh, George took off his own sweater, and I put it on Max. Willingly, Max allowed me to put his front paws through the sleeves as he sat on the front seat between us, still trembling but quite content. "Don't you think that he looks rather dashing in this red turtleneck?" George asked, glancing at our noble hound. Who knows what went through Max's mind, but ever since that time he really has hated water. He watched Hildy now as she raced back and forth in the shallows of the stream, feeling too smart for such nonsense himself. Besides, his stomach reminded him that it was time for dinner. Max knew that 5 o'clock each evening was the best time of the day, eating time. He looked at George, who was unloading the car, then at me. He gave me his paw and barked. "What do you want?" I asked, pretending that I did not know. He barked again, just once, but it had an urgent sound to it. "Are you hungry?" Max barked again, eagerly this time, for he knew that I understood him and responded with just the right words. I glanced at my watch. Right on the dot. "George, the dogs are hungry," I yelled to my husband, and there stood George at the door to our room, smiling, 2 dishes of dog food in his hands. "Ready?" he replied. "Dinner is served." Maxie and Hildy did not need another invitation. "Boy, are they smart," exclaimed Carlos. "How did you train them?" "We talked to them as if they were children." "They are smarter than children," cried little Francisco. "Sure, they are smarter than you, loco," laughed his brother, giving him an affectionate poke in the ribs. The little fellow did not mind. He knew that his big brother didn't mean it. We watched them as they poked one another, talking in rapid Spanish, calling each other names, and laughing. The next morning, we were on our way to the mountain. We skipped breakfast, planning to have it at the lodge in the village, but the dogs, of course, had their feeding. Hildy was still a puppy and needed at least 3 meals a day, while Maxie played on our sympathy by pretending that he was starved or that he too was a whimpering, endearing puppy. Sometimes he would simply blackmail us by doing his tricks, knowing we would not leave his efforts unrewarded. His tricks included giving his paw, bringing his toys one by one, and barking on command. He also could sit and come closer by easing himself toward a person without leaving the stiff, attented sitting position. Instead, he would slide on his behind nearer and nearer until his head would touch the person's knee. But his most spectacular attention-getters were speaking and shaking hands in foreign languages. Maxie understood and obeyed these commands in 5 languages: English, French, Italian, German, and Russian. When we left on vacation, he was learning his 6th Spanish, which Carlos and Francisco were teaching him. It took us a long time to reach the village of the giant trees, but we were not in a hurry. We enjoyed the gradual change of scenery, from the clusters of deciduous trees in the foothills with their bright green young leaves just beginning to unfold, to the darker hues of old hemlocks and cedars as we proceeded higher and higher along the winding road toward the summit. Once in a while we would spot a tall sequoia tree, a hint of the groves which we were soon to see. We stopped several times to admire the view, to marvel at the beauty of the mountains, the depth of the canyons and gorges, and the crystal purity of waterfalls cascading from the mountains in ever-changing, lacy patterns of splashing waters. The mist around the falls reflected the sun, and the colorful rainbow spanned the falls and the mountaintop like a magic bridge. When I was a child, I always had wanted to climb such a bridge, believing in my omnipotence. George began to sing Over the Rainbow, with all of us joining him again. We passed through an open, sunlit meadow and saw several deer grazing peacefully almost at the road's edge. Hildy immediately began to bark. Her shrill, still undeveloped yelp startled the deer, and they ran into the forest. "She always takes herself so seriously," Carlos said to George. "She thinks that because she is a guard dog and goes to obedience school, she is on duty all the time. She will learn. Max will teach her. Max never barks without reason. In fact, he never does anything without a good reason," George replied. True, Maxie always knew when to bark and how to knock on a closed door and be admitted into a room. He even learned to open a door by turning the knob with his teeth. He never chased cats at our country house, where we always have crops of kittens. On the contrary, he played with the kittens and allowed them to crawl all over him, licking them with his warm pink tongue until they would become soaking wet. Hildy, on the other hand, could not stand a cat and would chase it up the tree or onto the roof, barking furiously and preventing the frightened animal from descending from its perch. Like two children from the same family, sharing the same love and attention, but displaying completely different personalities, our dogs were distinct individuals. Hildy, a cocky, arrogant scrapper, ready for a fight, and Maxie, an intelligent, dignified guard dog who knew when to bark and when to remain silent, when to show his vicious-looking teeth in a threatening way, and when to smile. Higher and higher we drove, following the hairpin turns that reminded us of a road in Nikko, Japan, where we had visited a few years ago. Here and there we saw clusters of dogwood in full bloom, the large, white, delicate, waxy-looking flowers providing pleasant relief from the dark green colors of the ancient forest. We stopped at an observation point to look over the railing. Thousands of feet below, at the bottom of a deep canyon, we could see the narrow ribbon of a silvery river. Above us, reaching into the deep blue sky, were the high Sierras, covered with stands of pine and oak, hemlock and cedar. Still higher up, we saw huge bare rocks covered with sparkling white snow. I will go ahead and stop there. We will read chapter 2 tomorrow. All right, you guys, remember, it's cool to be kind. Hard work makes you feel good. And remember to ask your parents, what can I do to help? Have a great day. Bye.